Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
On Saturday afternoon, while the sun was still high enough to bleach the driveway concrete into blinding white, my parents pulled back a red bow the size of a Thanksgiving turkey from the roof of a silver sedan and announced, with voices bright enough to rival a graduation ceremony, that this was Lily's birthday gift. Everyone clapped like it was a wedding toast. My mother made sure her phone was angled just right, capturing my sister laughing as if she were in a commercial for youthful freedom and new beginnings. My father jingled the keys with a flourish as though he had just knighted her. I stood a few feet away with a grocery store cupcake in my bag, one candle stuck awkwardly in the frosting, because it was my birthday too. They had forgotten again, year 5 in a row, and I could almost hear the mental click as my patience finally snapped. People think you break from rage or tears, but I broke from silence. I hugged my sister, muttered congratulations, and walked to my car without waiting for cake. My mother called after me, asking if I was coming to the celebration dinner, her voice stretched tight like tape about to snap, but I didn't answer. I drove home with both hands locked on the wheel, my jaw aching from clenching so hard. That cupcake waited on my counter, untouched, and as I lit the single candle, the only wish I could think of was a rule I repeated to myself like a prayer. I am done playing the family's background character. I started tallying up the history in my head like a ledger no one else wanted to look at. Year 1, they claimed they forgot because Lily had a recital, and you know how sensitive she is. Year 2, they were overseas, and time zones make Facebook confusing. Year 3, a card arrived a week late with the wrong date scribbled out and corrected, as if that counted. Year 4, my mother called at 10 p.m. because my father's golf tournament had eaten the day. And now year 5, they remembered, but not me. They remembered Lily with a bow-wrapped car, and they remembered the applause of neighbors holding paper plates, but not the fact that their eldest daughter existed. I should have been used to it by then, but pain doesn't dull when it is repeated, it sharpens. I was always the one who didn't need things. I was the one who filled out the forms, who bought my own used Honda with freelancing checks and coupons, who never asked for help because I had learned early that asking meant disappointment. My parents branded me the strong one, which was their polite way of saying invisible. And now, standing in my kitchen blowing out the candle on a cupcake I had bought for myself, I decided I was done. I blocked the family group chat, muted my mother's calls, and told myself I would not explain, not defend, not negotiate. But then an email slipped into my inbox like a thief. It was from an insurance agent, addressed to me by name, Nora L. Whitman, thanking me for initiating coverage on a new vehicle, with my apartment listed as the billing address. I read it 3 times. There it was in black and white, my data, my name, my credit, already plugged into my sister's shiny gift. The policy was marked as pre-approved pending signature. I knew immediately that I hadn't given anyone permission, which meant someone had borrowed me again, the same way my parents had borrowed my birthdays, casually, carelessly, as though my existence were a shared resource. I boiled water for tea, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the binder where I keep every laminated record, because yes, I am the kind of woman who treats her documents like lifelines. Within 30 minutes, I had frozen my credit with all 3 bureaus, set fraud alerts on my accounts, and revoked every device access that looked like a family iPad or Lily's old laptop. If they wanted to play games with paperwork, they had picked the wrong daughter. At exactly midnight, there was a knock at my door. Not the timid kind, not the friendly kind. This was the knock of people who believed they still had authority over my space. When I looked through the peephole, I saw them. My mother smiling with brittle charm, my father holding a pen like a peace offering, and behind them Mr. Slater, the neighborhood notary who carried a briefcase stuffed with signatures and secrets. I opened the door, but I did not invite them inside. My father cleared his throat, his voice wrapped in false calm. It's just one quick signature, Nora, so Lily can drive tomorrow. It's nothing. Just a family formality. He handed me a packet already filled out, my name typed neatly into the applicant line, not the emergency contact. The digital consent box had been checked. The policy premium matched my credit tier exactly. I held the paper, warm from the dealership printer, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was staring at proof that my family didn't just forget me, they used me. My mother leaned closer, her smile stretched too wide. "Don't make this harder than it is. You know we're just trying to help Lily get started." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that made all three of them blink. "You came to my door at midnight on my birthday to ask me to pay for Lily's car if she wrecks it. Do you realize how insane that sounds?" Her smile faltered. "Don't be cruel. Don't be criminal," I shot back, raising my phone to record. "Say hi." Mr. Slater shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about handling it quickly, but I had already made my move. I told them flatly, "My credit is frozen. Whatever you thought you could slide through, it's dead." My father's face went pale. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. The silence that followed was so sharp it could have cut glass. And in that silence, I realized this was no longer about birthdays, or cars, or favoritism. This was about theft dressed as family loyalty. And as I closed the door in their stunned faces, my phone buzzed with a notification, an alert from one of the credit agencies about a suspicious attempt. I didn't know it yet, but this was just the first shot in a war I had no intention of losing. When I finally slept, it was the brittle kind of rest that never fully lands because your body is braced for the next impact, and the next impact arrived just after sunrise when sharp knocks rattled the doorframe again, not the chastened, embarrassed tapping of parents who realized they had crossed a line, but the official, staccato rhythm of authority, and when I looked through the peephole and saw two uniformed officers standing side by side, one with a notepad already in hand and the other with the steady, careful expression people use on bridges or roofs, I understood that my mother had chosen the messiest tool she could reach. She had called in a wellness check to punish me for refusing to sign. There is something extraordinary about watching a small family argument grow legs and run straight into institutions, because the door hadn't even swung fully open before the taller officer began a polite script someone had called. They were concerned for my safety. There had been mention of erratic behavior and possible self-harm, and could they please step in to make sure I was okay? And I felt the heat rise in my neck because I knew exactly how my mother had described me, the way she weaponized care by painting me as a danger to myself so that my refusal would look like a symptom rather than a boundary. I inhaled once, held the breath like a note, and then I did what every woman in this country learns to do if she wants to survive moments like this without losing the upper hand. I smiled. I invited them in. I handed over a glass of water. And I explained calmly that my parents had shown up at midnight with a notary to force me to co-sign a vehicle policy that I had declined, that my credit was frozen, and that the only erratic behavior on display was whatever magical thinking had convinced my family that I would bankroll my sister's new sedan. To their credit, the officers listened rather than lectured, one of them jotting bullet points while the other asked gentle questions designed to surface real danger if it existed, and after a few minutes of reassuring them that yes, I slept, yes, I ate, yes, I worked in an office where my boss knew my name, yes, I had friends who could confirm that I hadn't spiraled, I handed them my phone and let them scroll the video from midnight, where my mother's voice could be heard calling me ungrateful, and my father could be seen pushing the pen closer, and where Mr. Slater's briefcase, to my private satisfaction, sat in the frame like an extra with a speaking part. The officers looked at each other in that quiet way people do when a picture snaps into focus, and the notepad closed with a soft thwip that sounded, to me, like a tiny, blessed verdict. They told me they were obligated to stop by my parents' house and confirm that I was fine, and I asked for a case number because, despite everything, I believe in paper more than I believe in people, and when the door closed behind them, I leaned my forehead against the wood and laughed into the grain, not because any of this was funny, but because it felt absolutely deranged for my mother to escalate to police while still thinking I might cave out of embarrassment. That laugh dried up quickly, because my email pinged again with a policy update from the dealership's affiliated insurer, this time noting that secondary applicant digital consent has been withdrawn, which meant my midnight coverage freeze had actually done its job, but it also meant someone had entered my information into their system earlier that day, which required access to details I never shared, such as the exact spelling of my middle name and the address of my apartment down to the unit number, and the circle of suspects was a very small and very familiar shape. I poured coffee with hands that were steadier than my thoughts, opened my credit reports, and began a forensic tour through my adult life, because if my parents had used me once, I had no reason to believe it was the first time. And within half an hour the pattern flickered into view. A department store card opened during my sophomore year that I never used, a closed utility account tied to an address I never lived in, and a cellular plan that skated just under my radar because the charges were small and sporadic, as if someone had been using my good standing like a step stool whenever a shelf was out of reach. Anger came, not as an explosion but as a steady, bright pilot light, and I decided that whatever else happened, I would not play the screaming daughter, which would let them cast me as hysterical and pardon their behavior as misunderstood generosity. I would be the woman who files reports, who notarizes affidavits, who sends certified letters with tracking numbers that land like small, undeniable bricks. I completed the identity theft report, printed the FTC affidavit, scheduled an appointment to place a statement with the credit bureaus, and while the printer worked, I filled out a DMV form that very few people realize exists, the one that allows an individual to flag a vehicle for an administrative hold when ownership or insurance has been disputed using their identity, not because I wanted Lily stranded, though I admit the fairness of that image had its own gravitational pull, but because there is no clearer classroom for boundaries than consequences that arrive neatly typed on. Official letterhead. By noon, my phone had restarted twice from the flood of group texts that I was not reading, and I only glanced when a new thread popped up with a name that made me wince despite myself, Pastor Glenn, who had baptized Lily in a white dress behind our church's cheap fake lilies, and who never quite learned how to stop being a messenger whenever my mother needed one. His text was written with the pastoral gentleness that can sound like velvet over a mousetrap, asking whether I would be willing to meet with my mother for a healing conversation, because family misunderstandings grow heavier when left alone, and I typed, erased, and finally replied that I would be happy to meet after certain matters had been resolved, namely the misuse of my identity, the false police call, and the attempted financial coercion masquerading as a birthday surprise. I did not receive a response, which told me everything I needed to know about whether healing was actually the goal. What I did receive, later that afternoon, was a calendar invitation titled Lily's Victory Brunch at a gleaming downtown bistro with a patio known for its photo-friendly mimosas, and the guest list included half my mother's book club, Mr. Slater, two of Lily's coworkers who dress like summer always happens to them, and, deliciously, me, which might have been a peace offering or a dare. I declined the invite, copied the event to my own calendar with a private note that said observe, and then I checked the DMV portal where my administrative hold request had advanced from submitted to pending review, followed by flag placed, which felt like a judge's gavel falling in the quiet of my living room. The revenge here did not look like fireworks or confrontations. It looked like form numbers and confirmation emails and a paper trail that would later read like a map of sanity. And while a meaner version of me wanted to imagine Lily's face when a casual traffic stop ruined her champagne mood, the version I chose was simpler and cleaner. If my family loved paperwork so much that they showed up at midnight with a notary, then paperwork would be the language I used to teach them how to spell the word no. I thought I had bought myself a few hours of peace, but peace is not how this family operates, because a little before dusk, as the sky turned the color of old bruises and the heat finally slipped off the sidewalks, my intercom buzzed again and a voice I recognized from childhood Sundays floated up from the lobby, asking, with practiced kindness and the slightest tremor of urgency, whether I could come down to sign something small to clean up the confusion. And when I asked who exactly was there with him, the pause before he answered was thick enough to chew, followed by the words that told me the day wasn't close to finished. My parents were waiting in a parked car out front with Lily in the passenger seat and a stack of documents on her lap. And according to Pastor Glenn, they were on their way to dinner, but they would so appreciate a minute of my time before they went. I did not go downstairs to meet them that evening, because some instincts are not caution but survival, and everything in me knew that if I set one foot in that car where my parents waited with Lily and their stack of papers, I would be stepping back into the same trap I had been crawling out of since I was old enough to recognize the family dynamic for what it was. Instead, I watched through the blinds as Pastor Glenn shifted awkwardly on the sidewalk, clearly uncomfortable with his role as the messenger for something that was never holy to begin with. My parents sat in the car, my mother gesturing with her hands as if she could summon me out of the building through sheer force of parental insistence, while Lily kept flipping through the documents on her lap, nodding occasionally like a co-conspirator rehearsing her lines. They stayed parked for nearly 20 minutes, long enough for neighbors walking their dogs to start whispering, and then finally drove off in a flash of indignation, headlights cutting the dark like accusations. The next morning, the consequences of that refusal rippled outward with predictable cruelty. At work, my inbox carried a message from Human Resources requesting that I check in because someone had called the office suggesting I might be in distress. The language was polished, professional, and yet it reeked of my mother's favorite perfume, concern laced with accusation. I knew instantly that she had found yet another way to escalate, because if the police and the pastor hadn't brought me to heel, perhaps threatening my stability at work would. I walked into HR that afternoon, sat down across from a woman whose eyebrows kept twitching in quiet sympathy, and calmly laid out the timeline from the forgotten birthday through the car reveal, the midnight visit, the falsified insurance forms, the police at my door, and now the invasive phone calls. I handed her copies of the fraud report, the case number from the officers, and the email from the insurer, my voice steady but my pulse hammering with the knowledge that family was supposed to protect you, not sabotage your career. By the time I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said she would note in my file that the matter was domestic harassment, not employee misconduct, and I left her office feeling a strange cocktail of victory and exhaustion, as though I had run a marathon just to prove I was sane. That night, with my apartment dim except for the glow of the desk lamp, I pulled my full credit history again and combed through the fine print with the eyes of someone who no longer wanted to give the benefit of the doubt. Buried in the reports were traces I had never noticed before, little ghosts of accounts that blinked open and shut in my name when I was too young and too trusting to understand how much information had been handed over by parents who assured me they were just handling things for the family. A retail credit card from when I was 19, closed for inactivity, but still carrying my social security number, a cable account in a city I never lived in, conveniently opened during the year my parents insisted Lily was too busy with her studies to take responsibility for her own bills, and a small loan application denied years ago but still logged, a reminder that someone had tried to use me as a bridge and simply hadn't succeeded. Each discovery was less a shock than a confirmation, proof that the trust one once considered broken had in fact been absent for years. The anger this time did not flash, but calcified, layer upon layer, until it felt like armor. I decided I would no longer wait for them to swing the next weapon. I would take the initiative, and I would do it in the only language they respected: paper, policy, and official channels. I filed supplemental identity theft statements, added an extended fraud alert that would last for 7 years, and scheduled a DMV appointment to review the hold I had placed on the vehicle. When the clerk at the other end of the line confirmed that the administrative flag had gone through and the car was marked for review if pulled over, I felt a grim satisfaction settle into my chest. It wasn't about humiliating Lily or even about the car itself. It was about drawing a line so firm that even a dealership or an insurance agency could not pretend it was flexible. And then, as if the universe decided to underline the moment, my phone buzzed with a new calendar invitation: Lily's Victory Brunch, set for Sunday at one of those trendy downtown bistros where glass walls make every mimosa a photo opportunity. The guest list wasn't just family. It was half the book club, a couple of her coworkers, even Mr. Slater, as though the brunch were designed not only to celebrate Lily's new car but to broadcast it to every possible witness. My name was on the list too, an inclusion that could only be read as either mockery or bait, and though I declined the invite with a single click, I copied the time into my own calendar with a private note. Observe. Because sometimes the most effective revenge isn't dramatic confrontation, but simply letting gravity pull a plan down in public. By Saturday evening, the DMV system updated again, shifting from pending review to hold confirmed, which meant that if Lily drove that shiny sedan to brunch, the moment it was noticed by a patrol car, a parking enforcement officer, even a random scan, it would be flagged, questioned, and possibly towed. The thought of it unfolding in front of a patio full of champagne glasses was not exactly charitable, but it was just, and justice, I had learned, does not always wear the face of kindness. I closed my laptop, sat back in my chair, and realized that I no longer felt like the ignored daughter begging to be remembered. I felt like someone finally steering her own narrative with both hands. Yet beneath the satisfaction was a tremor I could not quiet, a sense that my parents would not simply accept the humiliation, that they would reach again, and that their next reach might dig even deeper than before. As I turned out the light, I could almost hear my mother's voice rehearsing her next speech, the one she would deliver when the world saw her perfect gift unravel in front of strangers. And I knew, with the kind of clarity that comes before storms, that Sunday's brunch would not be the end of this conflict, but the stage where it would ignite into something far more dangerous. Sunday arrived with the bleached-out brightness of a day that refuses to keep secrets, and although I had told myself a dozen times that I would not go anywhere near the downtown bistro where Lily's victory brunch was set to unspool like a carefully scripted commercial, I found my feet carrying me there anyway, not to participate or to perform contrition, but to stand across the street with a pair of sunglasses and the detached patience of a witness who knows that gravity is about to teach a lesson nobody can argue with. The patio glittered under glass walls and copper planters stuffed with ornamental grasses that swayed like applause lines, and inside those walls a curated crowd gathered around my sister, who wore a lemon-colored dress that telegraphed innocence to any camera that bothered to glance her way, and whose voice rose and fell in the lilting cadence she used when telling stories designed to end with other people paying the bill. My parents occupied their usual positions, my mother at the center like an MC whose empathy could be turned up or down depending on the audience, my father slightly to the side where he could monitor checks and receipts and the fiction of control, and they looked so exactly like themselves that my heart gave a small, traitorous tug toward the childhood memory of when I believed they could fix anything. The car slid into a curb spot like an actor hitting a mark, gleaming and self-satisfied under that late-morning sun, and the moment Lily hopped out to pose in front of it with her friends, the first clue that paperwork has teeth made itself known in the form of a parking enforcement vehicle rolling slowly down the block, its license plate reader scanning each bumper with the lazy inevitability of a tide, and when it reached Lily's sedan and paused, when the small device chirped and the officer frowned and tapped a tablet, I felt a complicated wash of emotions that started as vindication, mutated into nausea, and settled into a sober recognition that consequences would always look cruel to people who have never met a consequence before. The officer stepped out, exchanged a few words with my sister that I could not hear through the glass, called something in on the radio, and within minutes a tow truck appeared at the corner like the punchline to a joke my family had written with their own hands, and even from my distance I could see my mother's smile turn brittle and my father's posture stiffen in that terrified accountant way he has whenever numbers stop obeying him. If there was a moment when I could have softened, it happened when Lily threw her hands up toward the sky and let out a theatrical wail that made the patio audience lean forward as one. Because for a breath or two I saw not the beneficiary of years of indulgence, but the child who was taught that other people would always carry the bill, and who is now discovering that bills sometimes carry you instead. Nevertheless, pity is not the same as surrender, and I stayed where I was as the tow operator. All professionalism and no malice, affix the hooks, sign the forms, and ease the sedan out of its perfect spot, the ribbons of brunch chatter fraying into whispers that tasted like schadenfreude. My mother pivoted almost immediately, her hand fluttering to her chest as she addressed the bystanders with a tragic candor that would have impressed any community theater director, announcing that there had been a bureaucratic error and that they would clear it up by Monday, while my father, forsaking theater for triage, marched toward the sidewalk and scanned the faces beyond the glass until he found mine, because he has always believed that the person who refuses to play along is the one who changed the rules. I did not run. I let him walk the distance, let him stand at the edge of the patio and keep his voice low enough to pretend we were still part of a private family story, and when he demanded to know what I had done, I told him plainly that I had filed accurate documentation with the appropriate agencies, that I had corrected an attempted misuse of my identity, and that I had chosen not to be the quiet, reliable engine behind other people's shiny milestones anymore. He swallowed hard, glanced back at my mother, who was now managing guests with the brittle hospitality of someone splinting a fracture mid-party, and then did something I did not expect, because he reached into the pocket of his sport coat, palmed something small and metallic, and slipped it into my hand with a furtive urgency that belonged in colder, darker stories than ours, and when my fingers closed around the object and recognized the ridged oval of a safe deposit box key, the world tilted. So sharply I had to lean against the sun-warmed brick to keep from sliding off the moment altogether. He spoke in a low rush that sounded like conscience outrunning denial, telling me there were documents I needed to see, that things had been handled years ago in ways he had always intended to make right, that my mother did not know about the box, that nobody knew, and that if I opened it I should prepare to be angrier than I currently imagined, but also, unbelievably, to understand him better than I ever had, because what I thought was favoritism might be something closer to panic, disguised as strategy. For a heartbeat I saw the boy he must have been, forever patching leaks with tape and hope, and I wanted to ask 100 questions, not about the car but about the pattern, about the retail card from college and the utility bill from the city I never lived in, about whose idea it had been to mine my life for spare parts whenever their vehicle stalled. Before I could speak, my mother noticed us and swept over with a speed that belied the heels and the performance, her voice sharp enough to slice the air as she demanded to know what he had just handed me, and when I did not answer, when I tucked the key into my fist and met her stare with the calm of someone who had finally found her footing, she pivoted her rage into concern with a speed that would have impressed a publicist, telling my father that I was obviously unstable, and that this was not the time for old grievances, because brunch guests require a tidy narrative, and untidy stories should be told only in whispers. I stepped back, promised nothing, and walked away while the tow truck's taillights blinked like tiny, red metronomes marking the end of the scene, and as I moved through the heat that bounced off the sidewalk like the day itself was angry. The weight in my palm felt less like metal and more like the beginning of a map, the kind you follow not because you trust the cartographer, but because you finally accept that the terrain you have been living on was never what you were told. I reached the corner and paused, not from doubt but from a clarity so sharp it bordered on vertigo, because the key in my hand did not promise closure or apology, it promised information. And information is what people use when they intend to build a bridge strong enough to carry them away from a burning shoreline. Therefore I turned toward the bank my father had named in a half-whisper that still clung to my ear, and I started counting the blocks like a runner tracking distance, telling myself that whatever lay in that metal drawer, letters, contracts, drafts of a will I had never been allowed to see, I would read every line and let the words choose the next move. Because revenge is only satisfying when it sits on a foundation of truth sturdy enough to hold the weight of tomorrow. The bank lobby smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and mint, which would have been soothing if my pulse were not keeping time with the wall clock. And when the clerk slid a clipboard toward me and asked for identification before escorting me down the quiet corridor toward the steel vault that always looks, to me, like the inside of a safe argument, I felt an almost ridiculous urge to laugh. Because after years of being treated as a walking signature my family could borrow whenever the weather turned rough, I was about to open a drawer that might finally tell me whether I had been crazy for drawing boundaries or crazy for not drawing them sooner. The box scraped forward with a stubborn little screech, the lid lifted with the gravity of an oath, and inside lay the tidy chaos of a life managed by fear, envelopes rubber-banded into neat stacks, a folded manila folder whose tab read "Bridge," a cheap spiral notebook dense with numbers, and a smaller bundle wrapped in blue ribbon like a gift. From a thrift store, which I opened last because I already knew it would alter the color of my next few years. The folder labeled "Bridge" contained copies of applications and statements I had only glimpsed as ghosts in my credit reports, and seeing them tangibly, with my father's distinctive block handwriting in the margins, "Temporary, will repay, Nora unaware," made my mouth go dry in a way water could not fix. There were notes describing how a card opened in my name had covered a utility deposit during Lily's layoff. There were spreadsheets tracking minimum payments on accounts that used my Social Security number because, as he had written in a line that tore a small hole in my chest, "Nora's standing can carry the family through the storm," and there, pinned under a paperclip like a butterfly whose beauty you want to keep and whose life you do not understand you are taking, sat a letter from a dealership much older than this month's fiasco, outlining a financing plan where I appeared as secondary owner on a vehicle I had never driven, which meant my parents had rehearsed this play years ago and simply assumed the audience would never read the script. The spiral notebook, its pages filled with columns of dates and amounts and the kind of arithmetic that only looks like strategy when you refuse to name it panic, held two confessions hidden in numbers. First, that my father had made payments into accounts I never knew existed whenever a windfall appeared, a tax return or a small bonus, and second, that he had repeatedly promised himself, in tiny pencil letters stacked like vows, to make Nora whole when the house sells, which I would have dismissed as wishful thinking if not for the bundle tied with ribbon. Inside that bundle lay a rough draft of a will dated nearly a decade ago, written before my sister's reputation as the family's fragile star had congealed into doctrine, where I, not Lily, was listed as primary beneficiary of the house on Maple Ridge. A decision justified in a paragraph that read like a love letter to responsibility, and beside it a second draft, newer by a few years and clearly edited by a professional who had underlined phrases with practiced annoyance, where the house shifted to Lily with a clause about historical use, and where my name appeared only in the section detailing appreciation for assistance rendered, which was a euphemism so neat it made me want to peel the walls. Tucked behind the draft sat 3 letters addressed to me in my father's hand, unsent and undated, each version trying to explain how a man who loves both daughters differently can let convenience masquerade as love, and how guilt becomes a currency until you wake up and realize you are broke. I read them twice, then a third time, and somewhere between the second and third pass the anger that had armored me all week resettled into something colder and smarter, because while forgiveness was not on the table, clarity was. And clarity is a lever you can pull even when you are shaking. I took photos, closed the box, scheduled a follow-up appointment with the bank so I would have a documented trail of access, and then walked out into heat that pressed against my shoulders like a tired hand, already drafting the sequence of steps that would turn this little archive into action. A meeting with a consumer protection attorney which I could afford not because my parents raised a princess, but because they raised a worker. A notarized packet to the insurer and the dealership, containing copies of the draft documents and a sworn statement of identity misuse, a certified letter to Mr. Slater politely requesting a record of any notarizations involving my name over the last decade, and a calm message to Pastor Glenn that I would gladly sit down for a healing conversation once the legal unwinding was complete and the habit of using my life as a family savings account had been retired without ceremony. The attorney, when I finally sat across from her in an office lined with diplomas that looked like fortifications, did not blink at the story, because practice makes profits, and she sketched a path that was neither vengeful nor lenient, a settlement that required full repayment of every debt taken in my name, a consent order barring future applications without my physical presence, a declaratory letter to the DMV and the credit bureaus to scrub the filings clean, and, at my insistence, a charitable donation in Lily's name to the domestic financial abuse nonprofit whose hotline I had called when the wellness check turned my stomach, because while you cannot litigate character into existence, you can sometimes shame it into better mirrors. When the papers landed, the reaction unfolded exactly as I had predicted and nothing like I had hoped, with my mother calling me a destroyer of families in one breath and a liar in the next, with Lily posting a brief, glossy story about jealous relatives that made her followers flood my inbox with messages I did not read, and with my father leaving a voicemail that began with apology and took a turn I could not ignore, because halfway through, his words grew soft and uncertain, his sentences frayed, and for a moment I heard in his voice the tremor that shadowed his mother's last years, a hint of memory problems that could, in the most generous reading, explain forgetfulness and poor judgment, and in the least generous reading, serve as a convenient new narrative to excuse whatever could not be excused. I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and listened to that message 3 times, then filed it into a folder named Ambiguities, because sometimes you protect yourself not by refusing to see complexity, but by not letting complexity erase the harm. The settlement moved forward, stubborn and unsentimental, and on the day the consent order was stamped, I walked past the old house on Maple Ridge with the key my father had given me tucked in my pocket. And although a childish part of me wanted to try it in the lock in some ritual of closure that would make no practical sense, I did not, because closure is the story we tell ourselves when the truth will have to do. Instead, I stood by the curb where he used to practice jump shots with me until the porch light blinked like a metronome, and I called my parents together, told them the terms were filed, told them repayment would begin next month, told them I would not be visiting for the holidays, and told them, quietly and without triumph, that if care returns to this family, it will arrive as respect or it will not be invited inside. I hung up, walked to my car, and started the engine, and just before I pulled away my phone buzzed again with a final voicemail from my mother, her voice oddly soft as she said that she had scheduled a doctor's appointment for my father because something was not right, and that she hoped, one day, I would understand that they did what they did to keep us afloat, which is true in the way that calling a leak a baptism is true. And I drove away knowing that people on the internet would argue about whether I went too far or not far enough, while the only certainty I carried was the weight of the key that never touched a lock, a small metal question I might never answer, and a boundary I intended to defend even if the story refused to pick a villain.